This passage of Daniel 9, Daniel is an old man. He has lived his life. We often think of Daniel being some limber man, perhaps being cast into a den of lions. But at that point in his life, he had lived a full life in captivity in Babylon. He came as a young man, likely as a teenager, spent 3 years in the school of Babylon, being brainwashed to be removed from his culture, from his people, and even from his God. To come to embrace the culture of Babylon, to embrace the people of Babylon and their gods. His name was changed from a name that honored the Lord to a name honoring the gods of the Babylonians. And he had a great expectation nonetheless that God was working in his day. He trusted in that. And when you come to the end of Daniel's life, near the end of his life, he is faced with a great challenge once again, not this time with not with the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, but with King Darius of the Persians. And he faces the lion's den, likely as an 80-year-old man. Daniel was an individual, though he lived in a society that had cast out God, a society that had no interest in the God that had created them. He was a man that continued to be faithful to his God, despite the education system, despite the government system, despite the horrors that had happened in his life of being taken away from his homeland and family, seeing multitudes of people, his people, that were killed and slain, the horrors of war that he experienced, being removed from all of that and brought into a foreign land. Yet Daniel, in his heart from the very beginning, purposed that he would honor God with his life. He would seek after God in his life. And in the end of his life here also, you find one that is determined to seek after the Lord still, to be faithful to the Lord still. Why? Notice in verse 19, he asks for the Lord to hear. Why should the Lord hear the prayer of this man who's no longer in Israel, no longer in Jerusalem? I want you to notice in verse number 16, he wasn't asking God to hear him because of how great he was or because of how good and righteous he was. He was making his prayer to the Lord. It says in verse 16, O Lord, according to thy righteousness. Daniel continued to pray to his God 3 times a day, opening the windows, looking to Jerusalem and making his petition known because the Lord is righteous. He continued to pray because the Lord was righteous, not he himself, but the Lord. His righteousness is what motivated him to continue to pray and seek after God. Verse number 18, towards the end of the verse, he says, For we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousnesses. He just says, I'm not making my petition because, God, you owe me. Because, God, I have served you faithfully all my life, and now you owe some blessings towards me. He says, not for my righteousnesses, but for yours. Because he knew who his God was and the purposes and plans that he had. Proverbs 28:13 says, He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. That is our God, a righteous God. And when we see him as holy and righteous, we ought to be quick to confess who we are. And Daniel, we don't have time to read it this morning, but the preceding verses is a great confession of not just the sin of the nation, but his sin. The sin that he recognizes that they as a people had committed, that was the reason they were in Babylon, because of their sin. They had done that to themselves. It was not the Lord's pleasure to do that. He understood the Lord's righteousness. He understood the Lord's mercy. In his prayer in verse 19, he says, O Lord, forgive. Why? Why should the Lord forgive them? In the midst of his punishment upon them as being a people who had been idolatrous and left God, why? Verse 18, the end of the verse, for thy great mercy's sake. Because he knew God was a merciful God. He did not take delight in sending his people into judgment. He didn't take delight by removing Daniel from his family into a godless society, into a godless education system and government. He didn't take delight in doing this. Ezekiel 33, verse 11 even says that the Lord says, as I liveth, saith the Lord, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked. God does not even take pleasure in the death of those who are wicked and have turned their backs on God. God doesn't take pleasure in this. Jeremiah was a man who lived through the period of Israel being taken to Babylon, and in the midst of his sorrow and grief of what God had done to them, God brought this upon them. He recognizes this. He says in Lamentations 3:17, and thou hast removed my soul far off from peace. He cries out to the Lord and says, God, you've removed my soul from peace. I forgot prosperity. I said, my strength and my hope is perished from the Lord. Jeremiah says, I feel so distant from God because God's judgment has come upon us, because we have not sought him as we ought to. We have served other gods and forsaken our own. In Lamentations 3, he continues to say in verse 21, this I recall to my mind, therefore I hope. He didn't have hope because of how he felt and because of the circumstances that were around him. He said, I have hope because I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. What was that hope? It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. As we sung this morning, great is thy faithfulness. Jeremiah sang those words in a time where he felt like his hope in God had been removed from him. He felt like God had removed himself from him. But he was saying, but I recall who my God is. And no matter what has happened in my life, into the life of my people, no matter what has taken place around me or what may happen in my life, I know it is of the Lord's mercies that I have not been utterly consumed by the sin-cursed world, the struggle that I have in my flesh. He declared who God was again later in the chapter in verse 32. But though he caused grief, speaking of the Lord, though the Lord should cause grief in my life, yet will he have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. For he doth not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. God is not in heaven looking to afflict people in this life. He's not looking to point the finger at them and say, See what you've done? You deserve this. God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. God takes no pleasure in grief coming into the life of his people, and even of those who forsake the Lord. He's a merciful God. He would rather that the wicked turn from their way and come to the Lord. Daniel recognized this. And after spending 70 years in Babylon, his prayer still was, God, for your righteousness, hear my prayer. God, because I know you are a merciful God and you want to bring good upon my life and all those that will turn to you, listen to my prayer. What was his prayer? What did he ask for? Verse number 19, O Lord, hearken and do, defer not for thine own sake. O my God, for thy city and thy people are called by thy name. Daniel recognized and understood that from the book of Jeremiah, God was going to bring his people back to Jerusalem, to build the walls, to build the temple. And he makes his prayer to God and says, God, build those walls. Build the temple. Lord, the things that you have said you will do, do them. He prayed according to the will of his Father in heaven. And he was worthy to pray that prayer because he understood his God was righteous, and that any righteousness that he had in his life was only a reflection of God in heaven. That anything that he had accomplished in Babylon, of revealing the visions of God, of being a counselor, a second in command in the land to the king, of being rescued from the mouth of the lions, of having boldness to stand before kings and tell them the truth. He says, if I have done anything as of the Lord's mercies, I do not deserve to be this man in Babylon. But Lord, you desire to have your name exalted and glorified in Israel and in your city and in your holy temple. And so, Lord, hear my prayer. Not for my sake. I submit to you that I do not have what it takes for Crossway to continue. And if we would be honest with ourselves, no one has what it takes for Crossway to be all that it needs to be. You could take those who have great wealth, all the resources that we may need for our ministries and for the work that we do for God here, and it wouldn't be enough. You could take the most brilliant of minds and bring them together here to this place, and it wouldn't be enough to do all that the church is designed to do. You could take those who have the personality and the fame to gather crowds together, and it would not be enough for this place. Because this place is not a work of man. It's not a work that will be accomplished because men determined to do it. It is the Lord's work to be the pillar and ground of the truth, to be a place where the hope of the gospel goes out and it changes radically the hearts of men and women, boys and girls. That the only way Crossway will continue is if the Lord continues to have his way through humble, broken, surrendered people. And that is our prayer today. God, be glorified in this place, not for our sake, not for our self-preservation, not to save us from all the evil that may be around us, from the circumstances that are around us. Lord, don't work in this place for our sake. No, God, work in this place despite of us because of your great mercy. Work through us not because we are deserving, but because of your righteousness that has been shed upon our lives. God, be glorified in this place for your sake, because of who you are, an all-powerful God, God of great mercy. God could do this work on his own. He doesn't need you or I, but yet he has chosen that he will do his work through the hearts of men and women, through the words that they will speak of their God, of the great salvation and hope that is in him. Let your life just be a vessel that is empty of self, filled with God, controlled by his Spirit, and he will be glorified, and his work will go valiantly and do what he determines for it to be done in our lives.